Welcome to Future Forward, a limited series of conversations with diverse documentary filmmakers about our future during the crises of 2020. I'm your host, Anjanette Levert, purveyor of documentaries. I am a filmmaker, professor, curator, programmer, and coach, all in the documentary sphere. Future Forward has been made possible by Spelman College's Carnegie Rockefeller Divisional Priority Faculty Award, where I'm a lecturer in our recently created documentary film program. This series was inspired by the author Arundhati Roy. She wrote an article early in the global coronavirus crisis called "The Pandemic is a Portal." There is a beautiful and haunting close to the article that really stayed with me, and the essence of it is this: these crises are an opportunity to break from the past and reimagine our world. Since then, I have been meditating on that both personally and professionally. And because I have had these conversations before, I wanted to record the thoughts of some of the best and the brightest in our industry about reimagining this world of docs. In this episode, we have Bhawin Suchak. He is an educator and filmmaker. He is the co-founder of Youth FX and NeXt. He is currently co-directing and producing the feature documentary Out of the Muck with support from ITVS, Sundance, Just Films, and the Southern Documentary Fund. Welcome, Bhawin.
Hi, Anjanette. Thanks for having me on. I'm super excited to have a conversation with you.
So we have had many conversations, and so I want to kind of just start with this whole idea of, so actually you were telling me that you've read the article that I was referring to. And so I think that like one of the big things is that, certainly early on that everyone was like really reassessing their lives and what they were doing with their lives. Mm-hmm. And certainly documentary filmmakers are a part of that. So when you think about what has, we are 8-9 months into this, but where were you back then?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like at the beginning of this whole particular process, I think there was this really like, people were really taking space to pause and reflect. And, in addition to sort of being terrified of the unknown at that point. And I think there's still a lot of unknowns about COVID, but I think at the time it was really unknowns. I think people were sort of like trying to, in a sense, kind of like mitigate that by saying, okay, well, there's also some opportunities here. And I think for me, it's like, as I've, sort of continued over the months that the pandemic has happened, I think I definitely feel like it's been more and more challenging, because I do think, the nature of our industry is about being in space together, whether we're watching films together or whether we're in production together or whether we're in community with people who are, folks associated with our projects or at convenings. And I think that aspect of having to sort of go into our silos even more has been challenging. And I think for me, it's like, I also have been trying to really get the time or have the time, because if I can sort of compare it to previous years when we've sort of seen each other and intersected in each other's works, we're busy people and we're constantly on the go, and that there's not a lot of sustainability in that lifestyle. And I do think that this moment has also afforded us the opportunity to be very self-reflected, to sort of assess our privilege in a way, like to even within the context of being people who are from marginalized communities in many ways. I'll speak for myself. I also do have a level of like class privilege and a job and the opportunity to continue working, which is something that I don't take for granted, and I do feel like is a blessing in this particular moment. So for me, it's like this really important opportunity for us as filmmakers and as documentary filmmakers to really think about our role as storytellers in these, sort of transformative shifts that are happening. Like, what is our role, and how do we kind of redefine the center and the purpose of our work? And I think to sort of branch that out, I think it also has given us an opportunity to look at this field that we have been a part of, that we have had critiques of and have really had a lot of difficult conversations about its fallibility and the ways that it does not support and sustain careers, the levels of inaccessibility there are, and starting to think about how do we start attacking those problems in tangible ways and creating structures and transforming our thinking around this particular field, rather than just sort of finding ourselves stuck in a seemingly, in an endless rat race to try and sort of achieve this goal of being a filmmaker or being successful in this particular field. Because I think the definition of those things have not been set by us, and so I think as BIPOC filmmakers, like, what is the definition of success? Is it a Netflix deal? Is it like a screening a film that takes a lot of space up in people's, sort of consciousness and ends up being something that they think about for many, many years? Is it a film that has a direct impact on policy or, impacting a community? I mean, I think, there's many different ways that it looks. And I think for us, we've always sort of, I feel like, been sort of pulled into a flow of an industry that we didn't create. We didn't create the parameters. You know what I'm saying? Like I do not have an allegiance to Robert Flaherty. That is not my sort of, sort of guiding star as to what a documentary is, where it is for a lot of the, people who are in this industry. And it's sort of like us redefining that is super important. And I think that there's also like a multiplicity of approaches to doing this work that I think sometimes in these kinds of moments, we're forced to work in different ways. But I would rather say, how do we not just be forced? How do we actually take the time to create new frameworks of working together and building solidarity with communities, rather than just coming and sort of like seeing them as like material for a story? How do we build a relationship with those communities and really think about our journeys being intertwined as filmmakers and as folks who are dealing with, political, cultural struggles. So I think it's actually been, it's been very challenging. I think we're all sort of dealing with levels of depression and like isolation and, so I don't, by no means is it sort of like this, like, oh my God, this is this incredible moment to like, sort of sit cross-legged and meditate on our lives, because I do think there's also a massive crisis happening before our eyes, and our country is on fire, from the pandemic, from the further sort of exacerbation of racial injustice. And I think the movement for Black liberation is a movement that has been going on for, you could argue, 400 years. But I think this particular iteration of it, I think, is really also feels a different level of urgency, because the people who are on the streets are not the traditional organizers that you have seen in the streets before, because a lot of those sort of older generational organizers are not able to be on the streets. So there's a lot of young folks who are, in my opinion, kind of experimenting with methodologies that are sort of not necessarily like road tested, and they're not thinking a lot about like what people have done, because they're acting out of emotional response. And I think it's important to allow that emotional response to happen, and then to sort of find ways to coalesce it into larger movement building. So I think in the same way that those things are happening in the streets and in the world around this election, like we're sort of reckoning with our sort of like structures and the way that they have been, to me, the core is that they haven't been accountable, right? So now we're at this point, we're asking for that. And I think we're asking for that in the documentary field. And I feel like there is, for me, this moment where I think we need to really assert who we are as a community of filmmakers, specifically us, as Black, Indigenous people of color, as a group, and a sort of like an affinity group, if you may, of people who have been saying very similar things, but we've been saying them in the quiet spaces of our own sort of like, comfort, which is where you're going to start those conversations. But now it's time to sort of assert. And like you said earlier, it's like, the money is out there. There's not a scarcity of capital. It's how to sort of make it flow to the right places. And so that's something, I mean, that's maybe a longer answer, but I think that's really like been a lot of the different ways that I've been thinking about the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, you said a lot. I took a lot of notes down here. And I think, so let's go back to a couple of things. And like, I think that your opening statement is kind of like, gives us so much to talk about in during this hour. So the first thing I was thinking of is redefining success, or having us decide what is success, right? Because we're coming to this space with different, maybe some of the same reasons that that other people's come to documentary. But I know for myself is that I didn't see the people I knew reflected back at me, or I felt that like there was this broad brushstrokes of like who the African American community is. And I said, wow, like we're so diverse, and like we don't see like diversity within that. And so that's really why I wanted to come. Well, while I decided to commit my life to documentaries, and then inside of that, it's only really been recently that I have really started to grapple with what is success. Because I felt that for so many years, I was just trying to quote unquote make it, and was following this somehow prescribed path that actually equals success. However, like over the past couple of years since I've become, a professor, and the classes that I teach are intro classes, so we're talking about the history. But when I think about how recent the history of documentary, really truly is that actually there is no prescribed path. Everyone's just doing whatever they're doing, and like this is what gets created. Then I also have the ability to create for myself what that looks like. But, if you have more about definition of success, because I think that that's been something that gets talked about more. But for me, what I have noticed is usually in the context of people who are outside of New York and LA deciding what success is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's like that's a big question. And I think, so one of the things that, you mentioned that I'm the co-director of NeXt, and NeXt is it's a fellowship program that we're really sort of in the process of trying to see if we can kind of reframe it into a collective of young filmmakers, all BIPOC filmmakers who are at the beginning stages of their career. And it's all about giving them access to sort of networks and things. But I think one of the things that's most important about it is it's mentorship, right? And so it's conversations. And I was just on a conversation this morning with one of our fellows, and I think this pre sort of like determined idea of success is actually really problematic, because I think what it does is it sort of like it creates a sort of reduction in your way of thinking about who you are as a person, as a filmmaker, as an artist. And I think that there's so many different ways that you can achieve self sustainability, which I think is more, to me, the question we should be asking ourselves is like, how can I sustain the level of lifestyle that I want? And whatever that may be. Like, look, if you want to have a fancy car and live in a mansion and travel the world, 3 months out of the year, okay, how are you going to get there? You know what I mean? Like, but you can define that for you. If your definition of success is to live a happy, healthy life and to be able to work on a regular basis on your own projects and also like earn an income, great. That might require you to be working a day job, or might require you to really think about like, pursuing, academia as an option as well, in addition to your career. And I think like for myself and Darian Henry's the co-director of the program. For myself and Darian, I feel like our role is really, in a way, is to provoke and challenge people to get out of that stuck way of thinking that there is this pathway that you have to follow. And I think, unfortunately, the way our system is set up, it's like, you go to school, you go to more school, and then the idea is that when you come out of school, you're going to have it figured out, or like there's this sort of like door opens and you walk in the door. And I think that is not true anymore, and I don't think it ever was true for most people, and I think like how we think about that and define that is really important, because I'm a big proponent of no, school is not necessarily the right option. There's so many considerations when you think about student debt, and you think about the amount of in some cases, the amount of, stress you're going to endure by even going to school. I mean, I think about, people of color going to, predominantly white institutions and having to navigate, racism and all those different sort of like, microaggressions and being the only person of color in the class. And like, is that on top of debt, on top of the stress that you go through just to get through your day worth it? And I think like we have to break out of this idea that that's, oh, well, you got to go to school and you got to go to college because I told you, you can go to NYU and pay $65,000 a year, or you can take that 4 years and add that up. So what does that add up to? That's $250,000 right there.
Yep.
That's a startup. You know what I mean? That's a startup.
However, they're not going to loan you $250,000.
No, you're not exactly. But I'm just saying to sort of conceptual framework for how we approach these decisions doesn't really exist. We sort of just are like put on a little bit of a conveyor belt, and it's like go here, and it's like, oh, you didn't get into college, well, you're not a success. Now you got to do this other thing.
So I also would like to point out is that I have met with prospective students, and I have told them there was actually one young lady that I was like, you don't need to go to school. You need to go straight to LA because her parents had the kind of contacts that like I dreamed of, right? I was like, you don't need to fool with school. Go, like school will be here. Go. Right. You are basically, she was basically like a Kobe Bryant. Kobe's dad was a coach, he was like, right at 17, 18. I think they made him wait to 18, so it's like, no, you need to go straight to LA. Don't look back. Let me know. Remember, your old Professor Levert, right?
Like, hook me up with some of those contacts.
Right, exactly, because I'm gonna need a job later, right? But at the end of the day, what I love about this is that they have an opportunity to choose for themselves if they want to create something else. Because I said, but I'm here to create with you. We can create something else, and then also, and let me help you get where you're trying to go.
Right.
Like there's more than one way to get there. And what I love, what you're saying is that also, helping young people to really get that there's more than one way. Also, one of the things that I'm doing is helping students to think more entrepreneurially.
Yeah. Like
this is a business.
Yes, you have to.
And you have to treat it as such, even when you work for other people. If you have other people as a client, like if you're a business, because you yourself, your social security number also can double as a sole proprietor, as a business. Yep. So then you have a different mindset, you make different decisions that really enhance who you are and what you want. And then the second part of that is taking the time to figure out who you are and what you want, which goes back to what you were talking about, which is, purpose. Like, why are we making these films?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think what you just said is really critical, is to teach, entrepreneur skills and business skills. And like, there's a lot of technical work that goes into the administration aspect of being a filmmaker. I really appreciate you mentioning the sort of mechanics of entrepreneurship and that you're teaching those skills, how to sort of create a DBA and, make sure that your work is, sort of put into the context of a business. Because I think as independent filmmakers, we're often, if we don't have to do the actual work, we have to know how to fact check it and cross-reference it because it's our money or our funding or our projects, and I think that like that's not taught in film school. Like when we do NeXt, that's part of the process too, is that we do workshops on budgeting, we do workshops on accounting, and we talk about, how complex it's going to be when you get to the level that in your mind as a young filmmaker, you're like, I can't wait to get that production fund, that Sundance grant, that ITVS co-production, whatever it may be, because that's an opportunity, right, to like get funding and actually, get some kind of sustainability for and launch a project. But they don't understand the business has to go behind it. And like, I feel like it's such a disservice for film schools to not have a section on that. And like, who's really incredible about that is Yvonne Weldon. We had her as a presenter at our last NeXt doc last year. And she's just like, if you can't figure that out at the top of your career, you're constantly going to be playing catch up because, you're missing opportunities when you don't know that. To sort of generate, value for the work that you're doing, and also to articulate to people that you have a sense of what that responsibility is, because that's a part of getting funding. Like, funding is about also trust building. And, if someone's going to be giving you a certain level of money, that there's a level of trust that comes with that and accountability that comes with that. So I think that's something that we really emphasize a lot is that aspect of it, because I do think in today's economy, the way that it's structured, the way that monetization is structured, I think it's, first off, just to say, I think it's completely skewed towards corporate and really like very well sort of platform services. And I think that's a problem that needs to be broken up. But I also think that there is an opportunity to build an audience online yourself. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of smart. It takes a lot of understanding marketing, but you can do it. And you and I are from similar generations, right? It's like, if you didn't have a company you were working with, like, you could have just there was no online, there was no internet,
right?
And so, in this particular time when access to audiences are important, I think at the same time, it's really important for us to be thinking about building new audiences for documentary. And the thing that I always tell people is, in our program, we show documentaries to teenagers, and they literally, hands down, almost every single one who hasn't really seen a really good independent artistic documentary thinks of fucking Ken Burns, or these really,
I call them news docs, talking heads, random, talking heads, random.
Totally, these like formulaic things. And I think that they see a film that we show and they get really moved, and they're like, "That's a documentary," and we're like, "Yes, a documentary is a film." A film is a piece of art, as well as providing information and insight into a topic. It's also, there's an aesthetic there, and we talk about that. And I think, we have to open up new audiences to the work, because we can't just say, "Oh, we need more BIPOC filmmakers." Well, also, we need more BIPOC audiences. We can have 100 amazing filmmakers of color, but if they all end up at Sundance showing their films to a bunch of old rich white people, then how is that expanding the sort of like lexicon of our work, and also the sort of interactivity of it, where we're getting the feedback as filmmakers from our audiences,
right?
So I think there's a simultaneous
also we're
mission.
not making also, generally speaking, we're not making the filmmakers making the films for that audience, right?
Exactly.
We're actually making it for our own. So then how do we create new audiences, especially since so then that gets into, we actually need more film festivals, but actually, is it really film festivals, or is it just really that we need more funding or more attention to impact? It's like, is that actually the truth? Because when you think about Michelle Matir has talked, I've had Michelle Matir, I've had Dolly Turner talk about marketing, and they were part of the marketing team. I think Michelle actually headed it up, but they were definitely part of the marketing team for Daughters of the Dust. And they were like, we made postcards. We knew that the people who would be interested are people who go to theater, they go to live performances, that sort of thing. So we stand outside of the Apollo and we handed out, postcards letting people know that this film was coming out. So, and that's actually impact, because you're actually looking to get to the actual audience, that you're actually looking to target, and then also broaden, because those people, yes, they have a propensity, because of the other interests that they have a propensity to be interested in that, but they couldn't have known about it otherwise. I'm just going to throw out a crazy idea. Actually, I've had it for a while now. What would it be like to have a list of 10,000 people, so that and send out a list, every time that, hey, this film is coming out of the muck, is coming out, I have, a couple of hundred people, you have, couple of thousand people, to like shoot it out to 10,000 people and have even just 10% return.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think crowdsourcing ideas like that are really critical. And I think, I've been thinking about the sort of, I like, if you think about like the Southern Circuit, you know what I mean? Or more regionalized approaches also to distribution. And I think you're absolutely right about the idea of, regardless of whether or not somebody quote unquote picks up the film and, it's screened somewhere, it is really, our responsibility to build that core audience for our film, and I think part of that building that audience, it's all about relationship building, and I think it's a lot of work though. And I think that's the thing where, on top of making a film, you can't do that work. And I think there's been a lot of conversations right now happening around impact producers and the lack of impact producers and, the need for us to do more training for young people. And also the really, to me, incredible opportunity and potential of us building relationships with organizers so that organizers who know how to do that work, which I have really, really built a huge and deeper understanding and respect for organizers in this particular moment, because I think to organize amidst the pandemic and to be able to bring people out of their safe spaces to protest, to organize, to show up, is a huge skill set. And like the ability to do that is something that cannot just be overlooked. It's not just about creating an event page on Facebook or sending out some emails and a MailChimp list. It's about having the level of insight to how to connect with people and make them want to get up off their butts and do something. And I think similarly with documentaries, like what compels someone to get out of their house at this point, because I've been thinking about this concept too, is like when we come out of this, and my hope is that, we are not going back to quote unquote normal, but a new kind of normal that's a little bit more kind of like self-aware as who we are and all those things, but that we come back to theaters and we go and see films in theaters again. And what theaters are going to be left first and foremost, but then how are we going to build an infrastructure and a connectivity between those things so they're not so like disconnected? So like, is there like a network, for example, is there a network of Black owned theaters? And how do those theaters build relationships so that they can have power, like not only like have power as a unit, but can also tap into and build relationships with Black filmmakers who are making films about the experience of being Black in America, to know that here is an audience, here is a group of people who are already cultivating and connecting with their community, and they should be prioritized over a Sundance, over a Tribeca, because those places are literally just marketing, publicity, hotspots for documentary, right? Like that's why people go to those places, right? I mean,
absolutely.
I know so many filmmakers that go to Sundance and are not satisfied with the experience, but get sort of like credibility, get validation, get a deal, get, meet this person or meet that producer. And I think that's great. Those are all important things, but they're very transactional, right? That doesn't tap into the purpose of why we do the work. Right. I'll say for myself, doing the community screenings are always more rewarding and more fulfilling. And build more connectivity to the film. So those people go out and tell their people. And so, I do think like creating ways to build those networks is important right now, because we're in a place where we don't know what's going to come out of that. But what we can do is start just building those relationships and saying, oh, okay, how is this particular, sort of area doing as far as its access to film venues at this point, because theaters are, Regal just announced they're closing all their cinemas, and so all of a sudden you've got this big gaping hole, but there's no films right now, there's no movies. But when they come back, what's it going to look like? And I think it's something that we can potentially, reimagine what that space looks like, because I do think that's a very untapped resource for documentary.
Right. Well, okay, so here's kind of where I'm thinking with that is that, but I think that, the model for theaters, so because we don't have as many local theaters. So what I'm hearing you talking about is that filmmakers need to be, not need to be, but this whole idea of homegrown, grassroots kind of thing, when you talked about the regionalized approach, but what happens if your region is New York City or LA County? So that's where I think that it works easier, like with myself being in Atlanta, there's other, Louisiana or Chicago or that sort of thing. What happens if you're in those places that are very saturated? And then the other thing, which actually I suppose, you could still be local even in those places, because it's like there's so many more venues and whatnot to screen in. So you could literally be localized there. And then just also thinking about this idea of the collective, and now coming back to a better understanding that is actually through being part of a collective that you are probably better able to sustain yourself. And that's a collective that's formal or informal. Because when you really think about it, we do have these informal collectives, people that you have a tendency to work with. This is your second film that you've made with Ira. So like you created, and then you would use some of the same DPs, sound people, blah, blah, blah. So a collective is kind of created. And then who knows, those people go on to work together on other things, right? So this whole idea of a collective is coming, quote unquote, more in vogue, or at least I'm just noticing it more. And that really might be the way that, particularly BIPOC filmmakers are really going to be able to create something that's just much more sustainable, because you're fundamentally leaning on each other for work and creativity.
And I think you build a stronger base that is less sort of destabilized during these particular times, and I think I mean, you're seeing, like, for example, you look at something like even Brown Girls Doc Mafia or ADOCs, which are two really big networks. They're not necessarily collectives, but they're networks, right? And even those places have been like so critical. Like, could you imagine going through this particular period with no networks like that, with no ability to tap into a broader community that's literally like has your specific interest in mind at this moment? I think I think ADOC created some kind of a quick emergency fund. I know BGDM did. NeXt, we reached out to one of our funders who had given us project funding. And we said, look, we'd like to take a portion of that funding, because we had just opened up a call for our first funding from within our collective of fellows. So we have, 55 fellows over the course of the 4 years. And we opened up this fund, and we were just like, very flexible. But then the pandemic hit. And so we basically went back to our funder and said, we want to take some of that money and just literally say, do you need $500 right now? We'll send it to you on PayPal to pay rent, to buy groceries, to whatever, right?
Right.
Imagine if those networks didn't exist, which they didn't for 5 years ago, right?
Yep.
So all of a sudden this shit happens, and I can't imagine what that would look like. And it would be, we would not have a place to sort of ground ourselves. And I just think that at the end of the day, we can't deny that creating these institutions, these networks, these collectives, if anything, just provide a space for us to kind of like look to and have direct connections with people, because it's anything from like, can someone recommend, like a DP for a shoot I have this weekend, to, people navigating like really complex questions around like legalities around their films, right? So there's all these things that I think you have way more access. You have this like, you have this like group, this group brain that's like just there kind of waiting for you to ask a question. And I'm continuously impressed and like amazed and thankful and I'm part of ADOCs. And I think ADOCs is like, just has done so much to support and be a resource. And I think we're trying to model that on a micro scale at NeXt, and so are people like Firelight, and people like Represent. You mentioned Jennifer Chen, and like folks at Cartemquin, and like Southern Documentary Fund, and so on and so forth. And it goes on and on and on. And I do think that you can't have too many of these collectives. There's not like a critical mass of, we have too many people, too much support. No, like we need more support, we need more affinity groups. And I think we have to continue to understand that we are only, as strong as our community and as our people, and we're not going to go out here and just be like, doing this shit on our own, and I think like, for me, it's also about modeling a network of care to younger filmmakers to say that, we want you to lean in on each other, because if we don't have each other's backs, if we're just out here competing for the funding as if it's like a rat race and like a prize, like chasing the cheese, like no,
right?
Like,
the scarcity that you,
and I just said the scarcity piece is so important, because I've been starting to really think about this. First of all, there is no scarcity of money.
Right. But who creates that? How did we get that as an idea? And I think about like the whole idea of like, hey, only one of us can get it, like they're only going to let one through. Right. So then the rest of us are like, okay, well, next year,
right.
Well, we got it this year. So, okay, see you next year, guys. So it's the scarcity, but then, so now I'm wondering, wait, was that real, or was that created in our mind? And then, so now I have an opportunity to reimagine like no scarcity.
Right. And I would argue that the scarcity, well, first of all, I think the scarcity is created by capitalism, which is a system that's built on inequity. It's built on inequity. It's built on the need to have a stratification, and classism is built into those structures. So I think like we have to acknowledge that and not act like that's not something that is a massive, institutional structural force that we're dealing with. And when we talk about structural inequities, it's not our fault. You know what I mean? Like we're also part of a larger system. So what we have to figure out what to do, in my opinion, is to hack that system and make sure that we are able to reconfigure the tools that we have to work with and kind of use them to build something different. It's like everybody in a way has access to similar tools, but it's like, what are we choosing to do with those tools? And I just think, the thing I'd add about the scarcity is like, I think we have a scarcity of ideas because of that too. And I think people are often afraid to think outside of the box because they don't want to take a risk and they worry about how that's going to affect their future. So that's another really critical thing that I feel like some of these affinity spaces do, is they allow to have the safety to experiment with ideas and to think about new ways of approaching old problems, because, I'll use the context of like, police accountability. It's like, if we continue to look at police being unaccountable and not having any built-in structures for them to be held, to the same standard as citizens, we have to go back to the root of policing and why is it built that way, and then sort of extend that history out and say like, it's not an individual police officer or an individual act of violence or murdering George Floyd. That's just the tip of the spear. Like there's a whole long legacy that has created that moment. And in order for us to really shift things, we have to go back to the root of the whole issue. And I think that's where, it's like super important for us to not miss that and just deal with the surface, because the surface is easy to deal with because it's right there. And I feel like, especially in the age of social media, we have become trained to react. Like we really know how to react, whether it's like hitting that like button, that heart button, or whether it's saying some snarky comment or thing on Facebook. We know how to react. What we don't know how to do is create new structures, because we're told that's not possible or that's not what you have time for, you know? And like, I'm trying to really shift us into a more generative space as a collective in NeXt, because I want to say to young folks, like, look, here's the time in your life to really experiment with ideas, experiment with ways you want to collaborate, build partnerships with each other, experiment with the form, and really think about ways that you guys are visionaries and you don't have to just follow, like you can create an idea that's never been, thought of before, and I think you need space for that. You can't do that in a pressure cooker. You can't do that in a corporate structure.
One of the things that I was thinking about is context. Just noticing that one of the things that tends to be lacking in this new age, especially of social media, is lack of context. And like particularly historical context, given the example that you gave about policing in this country, but we have that like in every aspect of it because things are moving so quickly. Like your Twitter feed, as someone who had to do social media as a job, if I screwed up something, I would be like, oh well, just let it go because no one, I'll just tweet something else and somebody will see that, I'll retweet it. And that's also the same thing, even with the media is, particularly people who are, online journalists and that sort of thing, is that they're under such a pressure to just like get something out. And if it's wrong, no problem. We go back and change it, and so therefore you never have to really slow down and do the deep thinking and really check in with yourself with the perspective. But that, I think, is what documentary requires. And what I'm finding with young filmmakers is, and actually, you know what? Scratch that. It's uncomfortable for all of us because to make good films means that you are digging deep within yourself about like why you're making the film, how you're making the film, who you're representing. That was actually something that you talked about, is like the difference of being extractive versus intertwined with the community. And, so I was talking with Emily Cohen Ibanez. Yeah. And so she was saying that she paid her subject, and she's actually a collaborator with her. But that seems right considering that you've spent so much time with this person and you're recording and documenting their story. Previously, it was just like, what? We would never do that because they felt like it would taint something. But they get nothing for their 3-4 years that they have like been a part of your film. Right. So it was just thinking about, context being part of this new reimagining, because people step in at a certain place and not really realizing what's gone before. Not that, which is what I'm hearing, is that there doesn't need to be a dwelling there, but having that context helps you to create on top of that. So we've talked about a little bit about regionalized approach, theaters, what's going to be up with them, collectives, funding. Have we really, what are some new structures that you are imagining?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happening now that I see is that I think there's a lot of field building and conversations happening across groups that weren't really communicating. And I think people are starting to get together and see the need to organize themselves a little bit more rather than just operate as individual entities. One thing that I'm really interested in exploring and thinking about is like, what does it look like to fund collectives and to fund infrastructures that are able to allow people to also have a little bit more flexibility in how funding is used, so there's not so much restriction on it. And then I think partially for us too, is like, as a field, I think we need to think about how we look for money in general. And I think that there's a lot of entities and spaces that we really need to tap into, and think about where are the places where people are really thinking about, particular issues or about the power of storytelling, and how are those places being engaged with as filmmakers, and I think it's funny because I feel like the reverse happens a lot. Like it's like corporate America has learned how to use documentary or sort of storytelling in a way. If you look at like how commercials have sort of evolved, or just like it's like, you know, commercials used to be actors. Now it's like real stories. It's real people's lives, right? Reality TV tapped into that sort of like need and sort of consciousness of human beings to want to connect with others through television, right? Like documentary, like reality TV is sort of a new, you know, sort of manifestation of television. But really what it is, it's a sort of like bastardization of documentary, for lack of a better term, because it's like such of like, you know, essentially like pre-programmed and like, you know, manipulate. It's such a hyper manipulation of the documentary form, but documentary itself is a manipulation too, you know? So I think it's like, it's, of course it's going to be exploited in that way because people really enjoy being privy to other people's lives. We're nosy as hell, you know what I mean? And so how do you take that like natural instinct of human beings to be nosy and sort of extend it beyond the idea of like curiosity, but extend it into like, how do I as a person, you know, see a film and find myself in solidarity with those people? Or if it's a film exposing power, how do I find myself activated to step into that realm of taking a step towards exposing that power, whether it's a film about, you know, racial injustice or climate change or so on and so forth, going beyond just like, oh, cool, I watched the film. Like, let me go back and like, you know, have a drink at the bar afterwards. But like, damn, I saw that film. Like, how am I complicit in these issues? How am I thinking about them? And I think that, you know, when we start thinking about funding, I think part of the challenge that I'm always at is like, we know the two places that funding is most critical, in my opinion, and that is at the very beginning stages of a film, like the development to get that first bit of footage shot, and then at the closing of it, whether that's like finishing it using color and sound and needing that like kind of you know, sharpening of the film at the end so that it's really ready for, you know, an audience, or whether it's at the impact stage when we're trying to figure out, okay, we made this film, it's a great film, I'm super excited about this film, but damn, I gotta like go out on the road with this. I gotta get it to schools. I gotta, you know, and I think it's like you mentioned earlier about this idea of like networks, like theaters. Like that's totally like, I think like an idea that I feel is an extension of what's been happening recently with like programmers of color, for example, organizing and starting to think about how they can be more in relationship with each other. And then I think again, it's just another extension of spaces like ADOX and BGDM. It's like, you know, BGDM should be getting the money to then distribute to their people, which is what they're trying to do now. And so should ADOX. And like all of us know how to best actualize the money. I mean, look at what happened with Southern Documentary Fund. It's like when Southern Documentary Fund got entrusted, I'll say, by foundations to be the determiners of where the money goes. There's Southern Documentary Fund. Now, look, everybody, of course, I'm sure there's, you know, critiques of every process, but clearly they have a lens already on the South. So why does, you know, they're way more equipped to do it than Sundance or Tribeca or Cartemkin or Ford or anybody, because you're situated in the South. And so how do we even make that more regionalized? Like, where's the fund for?
No, absolutely. Because the South is made up of like 15, right. It's like 15 states or 15 states. So like, wait, we're entrusting one organization to like work it out for like 12
That's
states.
too much.
And like, is Texas a part of the South? They would say no.
Well, yeah, we actually had that whole conversation. No. Yeah. We actually had that conversation.
Yeah. So that's, I mean,
Jasmine.
Yes. So in many ways, that's also like problematic, is that like, and it's also part of this scarcity thing. You know, we have one organization that's supposed to work it out for states that, you know, all these people are a part of. You know, from where I sit, there's this idea that there's just not that many filmmakers. But the truth of the matter is maybe if there were more organizations, you would see a lot more filmmakers. You know, because I for one saw that there during the time that I was really getting started or making this decision to get into documentary films out of news production, is that there was like hardly anybody. So I went to New York where I was going to meet my tribe, right? And so now how can we create that for the people who are here so that they actually don't have to move, and some people, nor do they want to move. You know, why is it that the support is not there, you know, for people who are outside of, mostly talked about is New York and LA and the Bay Area, right? Those three places, Katimquin to some degree, but Katimquin is like on an island by itself, even though there's Chicago. They're on the lake by themselves, you know? You know, so just thinking about how can we, you know, expand, but are we pushing against this, a scarcity, and if you will, a mindset that you have to go to New York, LA, and the Bay Area, you know, or maybe Chicago to make films?
Yeah, I mean, I think that concept around, you know, the sort of location and where people are at, I think has been sort of shattered. I think that's another, in my opinion, positive of this particular pandemic moment, is that where you are doesn't matter in essence, right? Like it does, but it really is a way less of it's way less of a requirement, right? And I think part of that is that you can start understanding how to communicate. I think, for example, it's like people who have said that was a requirement were wrong. Like they were making it a requirement, and if you think about it that way, because I feel like, you know, even right now, it's like there are so many different ways that we are communicating and collaborating and partnering and working together, despite the fact that we can't be anywhere except where we are. You know, so clearly it can get done. Is it as effective? I mean, those are all things that we can argue and go back and forth about. I mean, obviously, there's nothing that replaces being in person with somebody, but it also opens up accessibility. And I think if you start talking about accessibility in the context of us having the access to people to just have a conversation with and network with and mentor, then I think that's a huge shift that we can potentially sort of use moving forward as a hybrid of the existing model, which is very much about exclusivity and not accessibility. And I think, like, I loved, you know, Chiwe's talk at Getting Real in 2018, where he kind of like used this phrase, the centers of gravity. And I think what's happening is that the centers of gravity in the film industry are pulling away from the New York, LA, you know, sort of nexus. And I think we're coming more into an acknowledgement and a recognition, and I hope an appreciation for smaller and more mid-sized markets and places like that are not smaller, but are really like creative and cultural hubs right now, like where you are in Atlanta or New Orleans, you know, or Nashville, or people who are like, you know, really like trying to figure out ways, like, for example, even like Memphis, you know, Memphis Indie as a film festival, Black Star Film Festival, and just starting to recalibrate the ways that we kind of think about things having to be done because they've been done that way. You know what I mean? And I feel like, how do we move forward in a way that those things don't get kind of forgotten and we just sort of slide back into the same mentality? I think it's really critical. And I think part of that is holding those places accountable so that there's not sort of a pass. Like, I'll be honest, like, you know, I think Tribeca shutting down all their artist programs, I mean, that was, you know, there's really not much that we can quote unquote do about it. But then Tribeca is going to launch their film festival, and are we just going to sort of come, you know, with our films and just throw them at Tribeca? Or are we going to say, okay, well, you know, how do we take a stand, I guess, as artists against, you know, the sort of like, you know, corporatization of those spaces and of the, you know, the artist funds and support entities that were supporting women and people of color and more of a global, you know, perspective in documentary are being closed down, while the corporate, you know, relationships to documentary are being expanded. And I think that's something that we need to, you know, be calling that out.
Yeah, and exploitive.
And exploitative, absolutely, because it will be exploitative.
Yeah.
That's all they know.
Yeah.
You know, that's their model, you know, for lack of a better, you know, sort of like, you know, example. It's like, you think about Netflix, it's like you can put the most creative, amazing people in Netflix, but Netflix has a mission that is beyond the humans that are working at Netflix. The mission is to make money for their shareholders, right? Yep. And that is going to happen by any means necessary. You can be the most conscious person in the world, but Netflix is going to do Netflix because Netflix is an entity bigger than the people.
Exactly. And exactly. And it was not created, and its mission is different from yours.
Yeah. You know, what's the potential for a cooperative distribution platform where it's co-owned by the makers? You know, like this, it's just about like really like we have to start thinking about those things because, you know, to sort of like circle it back. And I do want to just point out for myself, I do have to kind of get off the call in like about 5 to 10 minutes, but to circle it back to the sort of portal idea, I think, you know, part of the metaphor and the beauty of the concept of a portal is that it's an opening. But there's no guarantee that you're going to walk through it, right? Like that's a conscious choice. Like we have to take the bold step as individuals, but also as organizations to say we're willing to take this step and risk it and not worry about what we're going to potentially lose because we have no choice at this moment but to walk through this portal, or else we're just going to be stuck in this particular, you know, sort of like paradigm that is not benefiting us. It does not work for us. It is unjust. It's exploitative, and it's actually doing harm. So I think when we start really getting to the core of how we look at documentary, and I've been, you know, saying this, which some people are very uncomfortable, like to reckon with this idea that documentaries have not done the thing they said that they were supposed to do. Like they have not created a more just, equitable society as the pitch is of why documentaries are so important, right? Because they create this and that. And again, I'm not blaming solely the documentaries, but what I am blaming is the structures and how we position documentaries within our societies and our cities and our cultures. And like, how important is documentary to us in that? Like, I think we give it too much power. It's like, no, a documentary is not going to like change the world. But a documentary has a capacity to reach people and then catalyze people to think differently. And then they have to do something then. It's not, you know, and that's why I said, you know, at the beginning, it's like, we have to be in relationship with organizers. We have to be in relationship with communities. A community cannot be a raw, you know, sort of material for us to sort of figure out how we can exploit and get them to show up to our theater. We have to want to like be in community with those people for real. And I think that's the part where I do think these sort of like transactional extractive spaces in documentary and in film in general are damaging, you know? And I think that, you know, we do it because we feel like we have to, but like, how do we walk away from those spaces or make a demand that those spaces change and that those spaces live up to the ideals, you know? And I, when I'm saying that, I'm thinking about spaces like Sundance. I'm thinking about spaces like, you know, Getting Real. I'm thinking about spaces like, you know, Tribeca and Full Frame, which are spaces that I do think have the potential to be conveners that can be bold and lead the way. But I think right now, some of those spaces are also still stuck in affiliations and relationships that hold them back due to funding and due to all these other sort of external factors. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. And I think there's a huge opportunity that we should not let pass by right now to really dive in fully and say, it's time right now to completely transform things. It's going to be painful for some people. Some people are going to have to give up their power. And we are going to have to also cultivate a level of trust with each other as a community, that we believe that this is not only just for us, but it's for the next generation of storytellers. Because if we're not setting you know, sort of tilling the soil for them to really flourish and grow, then, you know, in my opinion, that we're not really doing the work, you know, and you know that as well, because you're a professor and you're working with that generation. And I think it's so critical that we model these new structures for them. So yeah.
I loved how you circle back, you're like, as I said at the beginning, and here we are at the end.
I was trying to stick to the theme. I was like, no, you did a great job of framing it. So I wanted to bring it back. So yeah.
That was wonderful. Now I've written down all these things that I'm going to do personally. I'm like, okay, I'm going to make a theater and I'm going to connect with these organizations and really, really do a thing and keep up with the students, so really.
But first take a nap. Yeah. Don't forget to take a nap first, because there's a lot of work ahead.
There's a lot of work ahead. I
don't know if you follow Nap Ministry on Instagram or Twitter or anything.
Nap Ministry.
Nap Ministry. You need to follow that page.
I will.
There's a lot of wisdom in there about rest. I think of rest as something critical now too. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Yes. So thank you so much for being with me, for being with us. And I invite people to tune in to the next episode. And until then, dream bigger for our future forward.